All right, everyone, this is Professor McLean with the last lecture of Unit 1, titled Co-Development of Environmental Flow Science and Policy in Recent Decades. In the previous lecture, we explored the origins of e-flows, and we traced those origins up to about 1950. After 1950, the pace of development, especially of ecology-based e-flow science and policy, increased rapidly. So in this lecture, I'll highlight only the developments related to ecology-based approaches, which you'll remember are those that trace their origins to the fisheries sector. These are also the approaches that have evolved into best practice today. Again, there's lots of information on the slides, so pause the video if you need to take more time and to review that information. Also remember that the PowerPoint presentations are available to you on eCampus. In the previous lecture, we also learned that the origins of ecology-based approaches were tied to the operation of dams, and the increased pace of e-flows development was also linked to an acceleration in the pace of dam construction. This figure plots the cumulative reservoir capacity measured in cubic kilometers between the years 1900 and 2010. The plot shows an explosive growth in the rate of increasing reservoir capacity after 1950. Also labeled are the years of major international conferences marking when concepts of environmental protection, integrated development, and sustainability began to spread widely around the world. This global awareness-raising period between 1970 and 2000 was also a time of rapid spread of ecology-based e-flows. The increased pace of dam building was not uniform around the world, however, and concentrated in North America and Europe, Brazil and the southern cone of South America, southern and western Africa, India, China, and Australia. I encourage you to watch the video, World Dams Since 1800, to see an animation of when and where dams appeared. In these figures, dams in red are those built in the year indicated, while dams in blue were built earlier. Now, I don't dare to suggest that I'm aware of all development pathways of e-flows around the world, and there's no doubt that many examples of progress and innovation are out there. But among the countries where dam construction progressed most rapidly, the USA, Australia, and South Africa produced the most widely recognized and adopted innovations in e-flows approaches. By the 1990s, there was also an active international community of e-flow scientists and practitioners, so lines of e-flows development began to intermingle, and progress in e-flows since then has been highly collaborative. Starting in the USA, following the 1947 to 1949 e-flows assessment on the Colorado River, biologists of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began to investigate in a systematic way the relationships between flow levels and ecological condition in rivers and streams. From the late 1950s until the mid-1970s, hundreds of systems were studied, ranging from mountain streams to large, low-gradient rivers. River cross-sections were measured, and width, depth, and velocity were determined for different flow levels. These variables were compared to known requirements for aquatic resources, and relationships were derived for the amount and quality of habitat versus flow level. In comparing results across many rivers, biologists noticed a consistency in relationships, and they translated it into an index based on percentage of average flow. We'll examine this approach in much more detail later in the course. Here I'd just like to highlight that this study was the first to synthesize the results of numerous systematic assessments into a simple index to determine the flows of water in rivers and streams that should be guaranteed for the benefit of fish, wildlife, recreation, and related environmental resources. As we've learned, dating back to the 1914 report of W.H. Shebley and the experience downstream of Granby Dam on the Colorado River, fisheries biologists were accustomed to dam operators ignoring their recommendations. So this method also provides specific advice for, quote, selling your recommendations to the general public, administrators of construction agencies managing water development projects, and judges or juries adjudicating water laws. The advice includes taking photographs to demonstrate the changes in habitat versus river flow and keeping recommendations within a realistic range compatible with the coexistence of fish and water projects. In the early 1970s, a major shift in power from developers to conservationists occurred when the U.S. Congress passed the Endangered Species Act. This law protects species that are endangered or threatened, as well as the ecosystems they depend upon. Over 2,000 species are listed for protection, including more than 150 fish species. Once listed, the protection of these species takes highest priority, and major water projects can be blocked or even halted mid-development. The power of the law is illustrated in the 1994 case of the Tennessee Valley Authority versus Hill, as shown on the slide. So it's a good point to pause the video and read the information. Another influential law enacted at this time in the USA was the Clean Water Act, which focused mainly on pollution prevention. State authorities, however, were also able to use it to enforce minimum stream flow requirements beyond the design flows factored into the pollution prevention measures. This is confirmed in another decision of the U.S. Supreme Court, as shown on the bottom of the slide. As these cases illustrate, enactment of these laws and the new power they gave to conservation interests led to a large number of legal challenges and court cases. This intense scrutiny forced EFLO scientists and advocates to up their game even further. In order to defend flow recommendations against the questioning of high-paid lawyers and their experts, EFLO scientists significantly enhanced the analytical rigor of their assessments, working to more precisely define the habitat preferences of endangered and threatened species, and developing increasingly sophisticated models to map suitable habitats in stream and river systems as a function of flow. The science and modeling became better, but the focus narrowed to the needs of individual species rather than riverine and stream ecosystems in general. This is a good example for us of the close and unavoidable tie between EFLOs and the legal and management systems in which they're applied. Many criticize this species-focused approach to EFLOs, but the motivations for the approach are understandable, and later developments did include tools to broaden the relevance of flow recommendation. It's worth noting here that this highly rigorous approach focused on habitat suitability modeling is also the dominant ecology-based approach adopted and applied in Europe, with a number of customizations for European settings. In order to facilitate the incorporation of EFLOs into broader water resource management, U.S. EFLO scientists developed the Instream flow incremental methodology, which is a decision support system enabling resource managers to analyze multiple flow alternatives, weighing them in terms of effectiveness in meeting multiple objectives, physical feasibility, risks to the biological system, and economic costs and benefits. Note the effort EFLO scientists were putting into building bridges between their science and implementation. This was a priority already 35 years ago, and is still a priority today. Referring back to the beginning of the presentation, where I showed a plot of the increasing cumulative storage of water in reservoirs over the past century, remember that I marked the years of key international events that launched a global movement to increase environmental protections and pursue more integrative approaches to natural resources management. For water, this global shift was catalyzed by the 1977 UN Conference on Water at Mar del Plata, Argentina. In the slide, I've highlighted a few of the recommendations coming from the conference, including the need for environmental impact studies and consideration of fisheries and wildlife protection in the planning and construction of water projects. These points and others were more fully developed in the subsequent 1992 Earth Summit and continue to evolve in the current Agenda 2030 and associated Sustainable Development Goals. These United Nations processes have been influential in stimulating reform of water laws worldwide and encouraging the incorporation of EFLO's concepts and practice to achieve environmental objectives. EFLO studies were underway in Australia by the mid-1980s and evolved along a unique trajectory closely linked to Australian legal actions and management responses to cope with them. Recognizing the alarming degradation in natural resources, in 1994, the Council of Australian Governments called for action to reform existing measures. In 1997, the Murray-Darling Basin Commission responded by implementing a cap on water diversions. The action was accompanied by plans to recover water for the environment and apply this water to restoring priority ecosystems in the basin. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority today has a vision of a healthy working basin where the water needs of communities, industries, and the environment are balanced. The planned approach to achieve this balance is to set long-term average sustainable diversion limits, which should go into effect in 2019. The diversion limits are determined on the basis of an assessment of the environmentally sustainable level of take, or ESLT. The e-flow assessment approach developed to support the determination of the ESLT is structured to inform water management across the entire basin by setting and monitoring flow-related ecological targets at 122 index sites. Targets are based on knowledge of flow ecology relationships and include improvements in the delivery of ecologically significant components of the flow regime, establishing hydrologic connectivity between rivers and floodplains, enabling completion of key ecological functions such as spawning, and generally improving the condition of water-dependent ecosystems. As illustrated on the slide, ecologically significant components of the flow regime include dry periods of no flow, which are referred to as cease-to-flow events, base flows, freshes, bank-full flows, and overbank flows. All of these must be provided at prescribed depths and durations during the appropriate seasons. We'll devote more attention to this approach and lessons learned when we enter the implementation units of the course. For the moment, note the unique aspects of this approach compared to those developed in the USA, with an emphasis on basin scale determinations and preservation of key components of the flow regime. Also check out the video describing environmental watering priorities in the Murray-Darling Basin for 2016 and 2017. The links on the slide and in the video, resources section of this week's unit on eCampus. I highlighted in the opening lecture the novelty of the 1998 South African Water Act, and now I'd like to highlight the novelty of the approach taken by the scientific community of South Africa to respond to it. Unlike the situation in the USA and even Australia, where an abundance of past research and data records were available to inform e-flow's method development, in South Africa, scientists needed to develop approaches to e-flows that relied on little data. Moreover, scientists, like the law itself, needed to recognize that many people continued to directly rely on rivers for the water and related resources that they provide. So the South African scientific community developed an approach that focused effort and resources on the assessment of essential building blocks of a flow regime that would meet the legal objectives of the reserve. This approach predates that used in the Murray-Darling Basin, but it's conceptually similar in that it focuses on protecting key components of the flow regime. However, given the data limitations, the framework allowed for the blending of expert opinion with hard data to formulate coherent and well-justified recommendations for flows to meet established environmental management objectives. This building block approach is also conceptually similar to the functional flows approach, which has appeared recently in the USA. Later in the course, we'll look carefully at the methods developed as well as the lessons learned through attempt to implement the South African flow recommendations. At the end of this last lecture of Unit 1, I don't expect you to remember all of the details, but I hope you'll take home the messages that evolving e-flow's approaches through the years are the product of co-developments of expanding scientific knowledge and tools with changing legal and management systems, and also that developments have varied according to particular circumstances in different countries, as well as different conceptual approaches that can be traced back to their origins. That's the end of this lecture. Thank you very much.